welcome to the show. My guest today is John Fanguy, the Federal Chief Technology Officer for Cybersecurity at Micro Focus Government Solutions. John, welcome to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Jason. Good to be here.
Let me set just a little context for our conversation today. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency released 3 emergency cyber directives in the last 5 months. It's needless to say, agency CIOs and CISOs have had this fire drill one after the other, patch those critical vulnerabilities in software. Now, of those 3 breaches, SolarWinds, Microsoft, and Pulse Secure, the SolarWinds breach probably caused the most problems. CISO reported at least 9 agencies were impacted directly, while every agency had to scramble during the first few weeks after the breach to understand if they were impacted or not. But the SolarWinds breach isn't just a one-off. It's part of a growing threat surface. The Identity Theft Resource Center found in its 2020 data breach report that supply chain attacks are increasingly popular with attackers since they can access the information of large organizations or multiple organizations through a single third-party vendor. ITRC says 668 entities were impacted by third-party or supply chain breaches last year. Now, these types of attacks will become more complex and challenging as agencies continue to live in a mixed environment of legacy and newer technologies. So, how can agencies prepare for the next cyber attack and ensure their missions are resilient? Well, that's where my guest comes in. John Fanguy is the Federal Chief Technology Officer for Cybersecurity at Micro Focus Government Solutions. John, we've talked a lot about over the last 3, 4, 5 months with the SolarWinds breach, but really when it comes down to it is what can federal IT professionals prioritize? How can they kind of reduce the likelihood or the impact of something like this happening again?
So I would say there's one key program that should be prioritized in the federal space higher than almost everything else, and that's TIC 3.0. TIC 3.0 program team has done a remarkable job at creating the new standard that agencies must procure networking services, and it's called TIC 3.0. And effectively, TIC 3.0 really isn't that much about networking. It's really about data protection and privileged access management. Who's on the network, what's happening on the network, what data is on the network, and how is it being protected. And that one program, TIC 3.0, is a mandate, and it's already in force, although the vast majority of agencies, perhaps all, are behind on addressing those things. Part of it is just sheer procurement delays based on their existing TIC 2.0 EIS networking, if you will, procurements. But the reality is TIC 3.0, I think, is the silver bullet, and it's a mandate. And while it doesn't specifically have any dollars behind it, it does completely round out the vast array of cybersecurity challenges that CIOs and their IT leadership and CISOs in federal are having to deal with.
Just recently, CISA released some new use cases around TIC 3.0. So I think a lot of the agencies are kind of on that wait and see. Are you starting to hear a lot of discussion about it? I mean, we hear about it in events, but what are the CIOs, what are your customers saying?
Absolutely. And in fact, when I engage federal IT leaders, and I just happen to mention TIC 3.0 and our ability to help support their needs there, it's an instant, send me what you got. Because effectively, every one of those procurements will require TIC 3.0, and it's a very broad level of compliance. But the products are out there. We have perhaps the broadest spectrum of products across TIC 3.0. And effectively, if you will, how do you achieve TIC 3.0 is a lot of what I do with these federal IT leaders. You can't snap your fingers, but effectively, in implementing TIC 3.0 compliant EIS or other networking solutions in the federal space will give you a dramatically safer, better protected realm across your agency.
It's also going to relieve all that burden of having to go out, come back. We've heard for years how, and I've written this story, TIC 3.0 or TIC and cloud just didn't get along well because of the latency that was built in. So in case of people maybe aren't quite familiar with the Trusted Internet Connections 3.0 version, just give me a quick walkthrough. Why is it so much better than TIC 2.0 and definitely better than TIC 1.0?
So TIC 3.0 is very little about actual network endpoint, which is effectively what TIC 1.0 and 2.0 dealt with. Because of the way the EIS, $50 billion GSA program was led, it includes software-defined networks. And that effectively created new, if you will, capabilities that TIC 2.0 did not address. The TIC 3.0 program team wisely looked broader than just SDN and created a very comprehensive, thorough, perhaps will serve us for the next 15 years, set of key requirements for TIC 3.0. And TIC 3.0 really has 5 major requirements. Manage the traffic, protect traffic confidentiality, protect traffic integrity, ensure service reliance, and ensure effective response. And I could go into each one of those. That they sound very broad and murky, but again, the TIC 3.0 program did an amazing job of outlining exactly what you need to address to achieve TIC 3.0. And again, that is a requirement now, and it's been in effect for almost a year, and agencies are scrambling to catch back up to implement those solutions. The good news is in implementing TIC 3.0, you're going to get a lot of things that you as a federal IT leader have always wanted to, you just didn't really have the mandate or perhaps the funding. Things like zero trust, privileged access management, data confidentiality, format preserving encryption of data, and a number of other things.
When we talk about this SolarWinds breach, again, it goes back to there's no silver bullet for that, right? It's a supply chain attack. It was a trusted type of update. But I think what TIC does and what some of these other tools can do is offer resilience and offer, well, we lost this part of the network, but we didn't lose the entire network. And I think that's the key here, is that microsegmentation, or something what we would commonly refer to in the zero trust framework, the idea of carving off a part of the network. So you're not, if you will, facing, once you're in, you're not island hopping, if you will. Talk me through how TIC and other cybersecurity efforts are kind of moving in that direction to really ensure that the entire network's protected, and it's not, again, once you're through the front door, you have the whole house.
Right. So the reality is what we learned from the SolarWinds breach, and then a number of others actually, is a few things. One is the data is what they're after, and the data will get exfiltrated by any number of means, because we're dealing with state actors as well as potentially insider threats, nefarious or otherwise. So protecting the data and minimizing the usefulness of that data should be priority number 1. So effectively, if you just assume that, all right, the data that we have, no matter how well protected, will eventually get exfiltrated somehow, insider or otherwise, how do we minimize that? And the easy way to do that is format preserving encryption based on the NIST standards. So NIST, always ahead of the game with the standards, already has this figured out. And there's a number of solutions, including ours, which can deliver this. And it's important to realize that format preserving encryption isn't necessarily appropriate for everything, but for anything that's HIPAA or PII related, particularly for federal employees and citizens, it's critical that that data be encrypted with format preserving encryption. And that's different than disk encryption and SSL, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, my next question is going to be let's define format preserving encryption, because I'm not sure everyone will know what that means.
Oh, happy to talk about that. So I'll try to make this very straightforward. Format preserving encryption is select field or subfield encryption using pseudonymized, tokenized keys that are secure either in the cloud or on premises based on your agency's preference. So the reality is, let's say my Social Security number is 410-06-3157. Typically, in most applications, whether it's citizen or employee, the only thing that's actually used within an application for verification of those last 4. So in the database, if we use this format preserving encryption to change the first 5 characters to something that really doesn't align to me as a person, but the last 4 characters are, then effectively we've made that Social Security number associated with my name useless to exfiltrators.
Okay, no, that's really helpful, because it's kind of a bit of a new term and that maybe people aren't as familiar with. It's only been a few months since the SolarWinds breach. Do you get a sense things are changing? Do you think that agencies and any large organizations are learning from what happened with SolarWinds?
I would say, based on the agencies that I serve and the federal leaders I've talked to, that there's 4 areas that the more attentive agencies are focused on. And those 4 are open source code, obviously, insider threats, SOAR, and privileged access management. There's a lot of technology out there in each one of those realms. And most agencies actually have some pieces of those capabilities, particularly in open source scanning and privileged access management. But in general, those solutions are not completely implemented, and perhaps they haven't implemented the latest versions and features.
Do you get a sense that there's a push now to implement some of those latest features? Privileged access management, as an example, is one of those. It's been around for a long time. After the OPM breach, it was a really big push for it. You go to the most recent data from OMB, and there's still several agencies that haven't quite done it yet.
Absolutely. You know, if you recall in the HSPD 12 requirements, privileged access management for systems was a requirement, and there's still the vast majority of mainframe applications which have exclusions from that because those types of solutions are not common in the mainframe realm. So that's just one example. In the open source realm, the statistics are daunting and have only really been brought to light basically because of this latest breach in the winter. Here's a couple of key stats. 90% of applications, commercial applications, rely on third-party libraries. And in total, on average, based on studies, that comprises 70% of the actual code in that third-party product. Applications on GitHub have an average of 200 dependencies. And 73% of applications have vulnerability traceable to third-party code. That's production code. 73% have traceable vulnerabilities. So that's one realm, open source, which is getting a lot of attention. The reality is open source is pervasive, both in federal custom applications as well as products that federal agencies are using. The challenge, obviously, is where did that open source library or piece of software come from? Now, supply chain risk management in the software realm is being addressed somewhat now, finally, by CMMC, but that won't actually have a significant impact in reducing the threats for probably 18 months, just because it's a brand new requirement that just went into effect over the summer. So the reality is, what do you do now? Well, you implement a code scanning capability, such as Fortify plus Sonatype, which effectively is aware of all of the vulnerabilities, whether it's Jenkins or Puppet or SolarWinds or other products. And as you're scanning your code, those vulnerabilities are being verified based at the DLL level, or if it's custom code, looking at the specific library that you're referencing as a developer. So that's an easy one. UEBA, user entity behavior analytics, is now part of a lot of solutions in the cybersecurity monitoring SIEM realm. And ultimately, that is going to become a requirement effectively by default or by legislation, because insider threats are a known challenge. And by insider threats, we don't just mean nefarious actors. We mean people who perhaps didn't realize the level of authority that the account they're using has, and accessing a database while perhaps their account has been compromised. Or, as we saw in SolarWinds, privilege escalation or vertical privilege management access creates problems. And so the SOAR capability, the user entity behavior analytics capabilities would, based on most industry experts, have been noticed, would have noticed the SolarWinds activities, even though they spanned many months.
And actually, that was my question, because one of the things about SolarWinds that I think people lose sight of, and there's a whole debate over the Einstein program, and we won't go down that path quite yet, but if you don't know what you don't know, then how can you stop it? So what you're saying, it seems to me, is you have known vulnerabilities that you can stop, but then the user entity behavior analytics would help you with those unknown ones.
Another aspect to your point of what don't you know is the vast majority of agencies typically struggle to understand the data that they have, and in many cases, the number of copies of data. So that exacerbates the, if you will, the threat attack surface at each agency. So let's make the numbers simple. Let's say there's 400 agencies in federal, and each one has notionally 20 applications, which is probably low. And each one of those applications has, let's say, 20 data sources, and each one of those applications has 20 open source libraries. You look at the threat attack surface and it's enormous. So what can you do? Well, we already talked about open source scanning with the right tools. We talked about number of copies of data, which is a massive problem in federal. And actually there's legislation which is in effect right now that directs agencies to reduce the number of copies of data and remove redundant or obsolete data. Now, How do you do that? Well, there's tools which effectively scan your entire application portfolio and database infrastructure to identify where you've got PII, where you've got HIPAA data, but also where you've got duplicate data. And obviously that's not a magic finger snap, but at least you'd understand where your vulnerabilities are so that you can begin to put in place programs to reduce the redundant data, the obsolete data, as well as we talked about earlier, address the question of privileged access management.
John, you outlined a lot of problems. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll solve some of those problems, at least try to. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network.